So we're looking at traditional Buddhist teachings that were given a very, very long time ago under very, very different circumstances to people that lived very different lives, perhaps had different strengths and weaknesses from ourselves, and which maybe need a bit of translating to be relevant to us and our times and our lives, to the spiritual needs we have now. So next week we're going to do together a ritual called the Sevenfold Puja on this Tuesday night, Sangha night. A highly traditional Buddhist ritual practice with a very, very long pedigree, And what I'd like to do tonight is to offer some suggestions about how we can, as it were, bring the Sevenfold Puja back home, as it were. How we can understand it so that it's relevant to our spiritual lives here and now, and not just some sort of spiritual fossil, this weird thing that we've dug up from the past, or even something a bit weird and off-putting. So my experience is that most people really enjoy taking part in the Sevenfold Puja right from the start, although there are exceptions. And I see some of them right in front of me now. For some people, the very idea of ritual seems off-putting and challenging. And if that's you, well, I'd like to, as it were, bring the puja home by explaining a bit, unpacking a bit of why ritual is an integral part of every school of Buddhism, every traditional school of Buddhism, the purpose that ritual serves, and why it's still very, very relevant to us and our lives and our spiritual lives. So some people have a problem with ritual itself. Other people don't have a problem with ritual per se. They'll take part happily. They enjoy the beauty of the chanting and the comeliness of the ritual, but they're not quite sure what it's about. It all seems a bit strange and foreign. They don't see it as, an obvious spiritual practice like meditation and practicing ethics. They don't see how it has that sort of positive effect on our lives, how it's a way to make positive spiritual progress. So a second thing I'd like to do, as well as talking about ritual and what ritual's about, is just to explain what the Sevenfold Puja is about, this particular practice. What is it about? What is its spiritual purpose? So that we can hopefully bring the puja home and give it a place in our spiritual lives. We can sort of rescue it from all those years ago and bring it into our homes, as it were. Into our spiritual lives. So those are the two things I'd like to talk about. Firstly, why is there ritual in Buddhism? Why is there ritual in every traditional school, and why is it still relevant to us? Why haven't we just stripped it out and concentrated on the sensible part of Buddhism? Which somebody actually asked me that. Several times, I think, I've been asked that. And secondly, what is this specific ritual that we're going to do next week all about? What is its significance, and how can we engage with it in a way that makes it a useful part of our spiritual practice? So firstly, why ritual? Why ritual? When I first started getting interested in the Dharma, which was an unbearably long time ago, sometime back in the 60s and 70s, in the UK, interest in the Dharma was pretty much all about Zen. Zen was like really trendy. Zen was the big thing. And there were loads of books on Zen, mainly written by Westerners, and mainly written by Westerners who had never been on a Zen retreat in their lives. And one of the things that was often said in these books, they sort of had this, they presented this vision of the, most of Buddhism being this sort of like slightly degenerate thing that's full of ritual, but then Zen wasn't, In Zen, if you met the Buddha on the road, you killed him. It was all sort of very, so there was no ritual in Zen. It was great. It was real Buddhism, not like those other silly schools with all their ritual and devotional practices. Well, actually, it's not at all true that Zen, that there's no ritual in Zen. Actually, there's loads of chanting and ritual in the life of the Zen monastery. But the really interesting thing, I think, is that the cultural atmosphere that was around And that knee-jerk assumption that ritual was a bad thing, that the fact that a particular school of Buddhism didn't have ritual in it made it superior, and it made the other schools somehow degenerate. That assumption that ritual is a bad thing seems to have got quite deeply rooted in our culture. And when we come to a Buddhist centre, we bring our cultural conditioning with us. I think a lot of this assumption about ritual has got its roots somewhere in the Protestant Reformation. It's got its roots in Protestant Christianity. At its most extreme, wanted to strip Christianity or Christian practice back to bare white walls, no art, let's smash the statues, no stained glass windows, let's smash them too. You can see old churches where this has been done. No stained glass, a few leaden, no proper music, a few leaden plodding hymns, a lot of disapproval and some hellfire sermons. So taking it back to that, really. Admittedly, there was quite a lot of degeneration had happened in the sort of Catholic Church before that, but there was something else going on here. There was some sort of psychological or emotional drive behind this desire to strip everything back to what was, get rid of all beauty, get rid of all images, all symbolism, all ritual. And this Protestant Reformation, I think, has left deep marks on our culture, one of which is an assumption that ritual is a bad thing. So when we come along to a Buddhist centre, we bring that assumption with us very often. So some of us turn up our nose at the very idea of ritual. You know, we think ritual goes along with the words empty and meaningless. And I think the fact that this is the result of our cultural conditioning is pretty much proved by the fact that in Triratna, we don't get this in most traditional Catholic countries. So in Mexico, for example, the people coming along for the first time, I am told, just love ritual. Like ritual, they do loads of ritual. Ritual is what it's all about. Ritual is a huge part of what goes on at the Buddhist centre. We might do it once every 6 weeks. You know. We do it a bit more than that. But so the response is very, very different in those cultures. People love the ritual. So we probably think that we live in a modern world that has risen above such outdated relics as ritual. A few weeks ago, Suryamati and I were visiting a garden attached to a stately home in North Yorkshire. So Suryamati is our gardening guru, and she, I won't say drags, she takes me to see gardens as part of her interest in gardening. And sometimes I really enjoy them, even if they don't have any vegetables in them. Sometimes they're really beautiful places. Anyway, we were visiting this garden. And on the way, we passed a couple of lorries. We had to pass these lorries and load them with big blue boxes, huge blue boxes. And on the side of these boxes was written, "Posh loos for posh doos." Anyway, so we got there and we looked around the garden, and then which wasn't that good actually, and then we decided there was no vegetables. We decided to go for a walk around the estate parkland. So we went around the back of the big house, and there was a lot going on at the back of the big house. People were erecting marquees. There were loads of people erecting marquees. There were lorries apparently belonging to a caterer delivering tables and chairs, and there were people carrying these tables and chairs into the marquees. There were loads of other things going on. There seemed to be a whole mobile kitchen arriving by the look of it. And then the posh loo lorries arrived, and they started pushing posh loos in a row. And all for... This was a hive of activity. It was a hive of activity, no doubt costing tens of thousands of pounds. And it was all for a ritual involving loads of people that was going to happen in several days' time on the Saturday. A wedding, of course, a wedding. Even this was a particularly huge wedding, but, they come in different sizes, but even a secular wedding, because this wasn't happening in a church, is a huge ritual, is a big ritual in which everybody plays their part. You've got the bride, you've got the groom, you've got the best man, you've got the bridesmaids, the bride's father and mother, the photographer, the friends and the relatives, the celebrant, and they're all playing their part, and they're all dressed in their ritual clothes that they don't wear at other times, all doing their ritual acts, right from the start of the ceremony, all the way through to the eating and drinking and the drunken dancing at the end. And all these people do this to give meaning to what is happening, to give weight to what is happening, to make the union of these two people seem meaningful and weighty, to witness it and make it part of public reality, to express their approval and solidarity with that couple and their families. So, a ritual. And then a few days later, we'd come home, and I was back on my allotment. And I was digging away or doing something, and suddenly there was this massive cheer came out of nowhere. This huge, deep cheer came out of nowhere. Tens of thousands of people shouting at the tops of their voices in a way that could be heard a mile off. Because I was a mile off, and it was really loud. A football match. 22 men on a field kicking a ball around in a ritualised way, according to a ritualised set of rules. Tens of thousands of spectators playing their part with their ritual chants and their ritual cheers and their boos, ritually acting out a sort of tribal conflict, giving their ritual cheer or their groan when the ritual aim of getting a ball between two posts is achieved. A football match is a huge ritual in which tens of thousands of people sometimes take part. They do it Sheffield Wednesday, still, for some reason. And they do this to give meaning and weight to something which otherwise would have no meaning and weight. And to express and strengthen their sense of solidarity with each other. And that ritual gives so much meaning and weight to this ultimately meaningful pastime of 22 men kicking a ball around that people get hugely excited and elated or depressed about the results. So ritual really works to give meaning and weight, even to things as completely pointless as a football match. Ritual is an integral part of human life. We are social creatures, and the way we express this is through all sorts of ritualized activities that we do together. We mark the stages of the year with rituals, like all the stuff that goes on at Christmas, buying presents, etc., etc., a whole ritual thing, New Year, Easter, bank holidays, trips to the coast, bonfire night, fireworks, etc., etc. Birthday rituals, graduation rituals. You can just, so many activities. Even the way we make our tea is a ritual. Ritual is an integral part of human life. And it serves a very real purpose because, at its most meaningful, it gives meaning and weight to things, and it strengthens the bonds that tie us together. Gives meaning and weight to events, and it strengthens the bonds that tie us together. It's a way we express our solidarity with each other, and it creates a public shared reality that we all take part in, that we all acknowledge. So we have that phrase, meaningless ritual, empty ritual, that gets bandied around, and we often think that ritual is irrational. But a lot of ritual is anything but meaningless, and a lot of ritual is very, very rational. It has very, very rational aims. So I think it was the psychologist Erich Fromm who coined the phrase rational ritual. He talked about rational ritual. And he had a fairly famous description of rational ritual. He said it is shared action expressive of common strivings rooted in shared values. And that's not a bad description of what Buddhist ritual is all about. It leaves a few things out, but it's not a bad description of what Buddhist ritual is about and why ritual is such an important part of all schools of Buddhism and of human activity. So Buddhist ritual is shared action. Shared action of body, speech, and mind involves all three, in which we express and strengthen the values we have in common, so that it brings us together and it gives weight and meaning to those values and weight and meaning to our common aspirations. Weight and meaning to what we're doing together. It gets our emotions behind it, so that all of us is behind it in the way that people can get behind a football match. Yeah, it can get... If ritual can give weight and meaning and get people emotionally aroused to a passion about something like a football match, imagine what it can do when we direct it as the most meaningful thing in our lives. Like the aim of each of us to grow into a wiser and mature person. Like our shared aim to create a spiritual community in which we can become the higher beings we've got potential to be. When we do ritual, we strengthen and we express that. We imbue it with weight and meaning. The weight and meaning it deserves, and we make it part of our shared public reality that we share together. And sharing it makes it that much more powerful. And this strengthens the bonds of metta and friendship that bind us together as a community. It helps us to become a sangha. And the more we become a sangha, the more each of us will benefit individually. So that's a bit about why we do ritual. I hope that's brought out something about ritual, about how ritual is something that human beings do. The idea that we can somehow do without it is a bit sort of alienated intellect, really. We do it together, and it gives that weight and meaning, and it brings us together. That's why we do it. It's not empty and meaningless, but in fact it can be a powerful aspect of our spiritual lives. So what I'd like to do now is to say something about the specific Buddhist ritual that we'll do next week, the sevenfold puja. What's it about? What's it about? What's its purpose? What's its spiritual purpose? And how can we engage in it in a way that works for us rather than seeing it as something sort of strange and exotic from a long time ago? How do we bring the sevenfold puja home to our practice? So to do that, to bring it home, we have to know what it's about. We have to know what it's about. And the very first words of the sevenfold puja, the version of the sevenfold puja we'll do next week, are in order to invite the enlightened mind. And that is what the sevenfold puja is about, at least in the first instance. It's a practice designed to help us to invite the enlightened mind into our experience, into our mind. Am I okay sound-wise? Yeah, okay. It's a practice designed to open us up to the enlightened mind, to create the sort of environment in which our small minds can allow that much larger enlightened mind to come into us and express itself through us. So we're inviting the enlightened mind initially into our experience and into our minds. So the word that's in traditional text, the words that's used that I'm calling enlightened mind is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta. Bodhi means awakened, enlightened. Chitta means mind and heart. So you could say the awakened heart, the enlightened mind. The bodhicitta, yes, we could translate it as the enlightened mind, but it's got a sort of specific connotations within Buddhism. The connotations are that it's that aspect of enlightenment which feels solidarity with all beings, that wants to be of service to all beings and to the universe. It's that aspect of enlightenment, the aspect of enlightenment that has this tremendous sense of solidarity with all beings and wishes to be of service. Anyway, this idea, this way of looking at spiritual practice, seeing spiritual practice is about inviting the enlightened mind into our minds from the outside, as it were. That may seem a bit strange and new to us at first. We're probably more used to thinking in terms of sort of creating our own enlightened mind inside us. We sort of work on this and work on that and make ourselves more enlightened. But the enlightened mind, really, in its fullness, is something outside our present experience. It's outside of our present personality. So we're going to experience it as something outside. We are going to experience it as something outside our present personality. So thinking of it as something that we must invite in, that we can only invite in, something coming from outside that we need to prepare a suitable environment for, that is a very useful way of looking at what spiritual practice is about, which can really, it needs to go along with what we also work on ourselves, but it can really enrich the way we see the spiritual life. And it's a way of thinking about practice that's got a really long pedigree in Buddhism. So the words that we're going to use, the words that we use in this practice, the words that we use in the Sevenfold Puja, they're taken from a poem by an 8th century Buddhist monk, Indian monk called Shantideva. And that poem is called the Bodhicharya Avatara, the guide to the path of enlightenment, or the guide to the path of wisdom. And Shantideva, the practice is in Shantideva's long poem, 10-chapter poem. But he didn't invent the practice. It had been around for a very long time, and it crops up in some sutras that occur much earlier than him. But he used his skills as a Sanskrit poet. I mean, I'm told it's very, very beautiful Sanskrit poetry. He used his skills as a Sanskrit poet to make it as moving and therefore as effective as he could. And the words of the Sevenfold Puja that we use are translated Shantideva's words. So hopefully some of the poetry from the Sanskrit comes across. And we use a condensed version. We just use a selection. In his book, it's three whole chapters. We use a selection from that. So the Sevenfold Puja, what is it? It's a practice we do that is part meditation, part reflection, and partly an exercise in using the imagination to conjure up images that affect how we feel. And it's a ritual that involves our whole being. We engage in it with our speech, with our mind, and with our body. And because it uses body, speech, and mind together, these three major aspects of our being, it can be particularly powerful if we engage with it wholeheartedly. And what it sets out to do is to lead us through a progressive series of seven moods, 7 states of mind, 7 emotional states that build on each other and lead us from, as it were, inviting the enlightened mind into our experience by becoming aware of it, to actually giving ourselves to the enlightened mind, opening up, getting our own small mind out of the way, and opening up to the enlightened mind. And because it's the bodhicitta, that aspect of the enlightened mind that we're giving ourselves up to, giving ourselves as a resource to all beings, offering ourselves to the universe as a resource out of love for the world. So we start by inviting the enlightened mind in the first stage, symbolized by the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, bringing them into our mind, and by the 7th stage, going through 7 progressive moods. By the 7th stage, we are, as it were, giving ourselves to them. That's the overall practice. And I have to say, it's quite an advanced practice. I think at one point, Sangharakshita said that if he'd thought about it a bit more, he probably would have restricted it to order members. So you're getting a taste of a really advanced practice. It's got 7 stages, the sevenfold puja. How surprising is that? And the first one we usually call worship. We could call it offerings, actually, but we call it worship. So in this stage, we imagine ourselves making offerings to the Buddhas, to the Dharma, and to the sons and daughters of the Buddha, the concrete expressions of the enlightened mind. And what we're doing in this stage is, if you like, inviting the enlightened mind into our experience, into our world, into our home, by just calling that to mind. And we've chosen only part. We can only choose part of every aspect of the sevenfold puja, because otherwise it'd be very, very long. In the version that we will do next week, we focus very much on making offerings of natural beauty. But there's other versions, and actually the version that's done more often in Triratna, which is the standard version really, uses a different selection. It uses a different section of verses which focus more on this idea, on the idea of inviting an honoured guest into our home. It's very much centred on inviting an honoured guest in our home. In the version we'll do next week, we don't so much use that imagery because it often isn't very accessible to Western people. It's quite Indian cultural. But as I say, in the sort of standard version, the imagery is of inviting an honoured guest into our home. And we imagine ourselves offering the 7 traditional offerings in India that you make to an honoured guest when you invite them into your home. 2 types of food, hard and soft. I always imagine dal and chapatis. Water for washing, water for drinking, you perfume the environment, you offer light, etc., etc. So there are 7 traditional offerings that are made to the honoured guest. And these 7 traditional offerings, they're always sort of present on our shrines. The 7 bowls that you will always see on a shrine represent the 7 traditional offerings to an honoured guest. We're inviting the enlightened mind into our space. We symbolise that by having the 7 offering bowls on the shrine. So as I say, in the version we do next week, we don't so much use that imagery, but it should be there in our minds that that's what we're doing. We can use the offering bowls to sort of remind us of that. Instead, we imagine images of natural beauty. We imagine ourselves offering what we find most beautiful. And we do this, I think, because that seems much more accessible to many Westerners. And nature tends to be our way into a sense of reverence, initially at least, much more than perhaps images of Buddhas, etc. So imagining beauty puts us in touch with higher states. It, as it were, beautifies our mind. Our mind is like a canvas. I mean, sometimes it can be horrible, and sometimes it can be beautiful, depending on what's in it, basically. And imagining beauty beautifies the mind. It makes it a beautiful space. If we're going to invite the enlightened mind into our mind, that honoured guest, that ultimately honoured guest, we want to make the space we're inviting them into as beautiful as possible. They won't come otherwise. If we invite, think of who you'd be most in awe of inviting into your house, and then imagine it being really messy. Well, they're probably not going to stay very long. Yes, well, that's very interesting. I think I've got another appointment. Someone we greatly admire, some world-famous figure we greatly admire. We would want to make our house or our flat or our room as beautiful as possible. We want to offer beautiful things, nice food and drink, somewhere comfortable to sit, make the place smell nice. We wouldn't want them to feel jarred or repelled by ugliness or smelliness or dinginess. So that's the first stage. Inviting the enlightened mind, making offerings, imagining beauty to beautify our mind, to make it a suitable place. And having made that invitation, the first stage, worship, we normally chant a mantra. And that mantra is, as it were, invoking some aspect of the enlightened mind. It's putting us in touch with some aspect of the enlightened mind. It's an extension of the invitation. We're inviting that aspect of the enlightened mind into our space, bringing some aspect of the enlightened mind into our awareness. And at this stage, while the mantra is going on, people have the opportunity during that mantra to come up and make offerings to the shrine, usually of incense, lights, etc. You don't have to do that, but many people will do that during that mantra. So people at that stage, if they want to, would bow to the shrine and then in a comely manner make an offering to the shrine. So we don't just engage our mind and our speech with repeating the words and the chanting, we engage our bodies as well, and this can make it particularly effective. I remember when I first came across a puja, well, the first time I came across a puja, I thought, what are they doing? I was very imbued with this sort of Zen approach that I talked about. Oh, God, look at them. Then, over time, I sort of got the idea, well, maybe it's not so bad as all that, but bowing. No, sorry, I can't. It's such a vivid gesture of, I actually think that's bigger than me, that our little ego really doesn't want to do it, which is what makes it so powerful. It is such a, it's got real emotional clout to bow. It's so vividly saying, actually, I regard that ideal as higher than myself as I am now. Hence, that's probably why, if you feel, well, I'm not doing that, fair enough. It's quite, I read this book actually by a Zen practitioner who said that bowing was the most important practice. Because bowing is saying there is something higher than me that I respect, that I wish to move towards. So we bow. It may be difficult at first, but that act of bow, you don't have to. You don't have to. And I should say that during the puja, if you haven't done it before, nobody's thinking, well, they didn't get up. Or they did that wrong. It's not like that. Okay. But there is that opportunity to express in that express something in that very, very vivid way. If we invited an honoured guest into our house, we might actually wish to bow to them. We might actually wish to show them that we respect them enough for that. So that act of bowing moves us on to the next stage, which is called salutation in the way we translate it. Salutation just means a respectful greeting. But in the East, a respectful greeting does not mean howdy or you all right? It means bowing. It means bowing. At least bowing. So having invited the enlightened mind, invited the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas into our experience in the previous section, we conjure up this image again of ourselves bowing to them. And the sort of transition to that is actually bowing to them. By bowing, we acknowledge that the bodhicitta is bigger than we are, that the bodhisattvas stand above us. And in fact, in that stage of the puja, we're invited to imagine ourselves bowing as many times as there are atoms in the 1,000 million worlds. Traditional commentaries on the practice say, well, you don't imagine yourself doing it that many times because that would take a very, very long time. But what you imagine is a little copy of yourself in every atom of the universe bowing, so that it's sort of like you and everything bowing at once. So it connects you to everything and everyone, and it also connects you to what you're bowing to. So yes, of course, if we were inviting an honoured guest someone we greatly respect, we need to show that respect. Acknowledge that there are things about them that we can only aspire to. So we show this, we bow. In that section, firstly, we imagine ourselves bowing to each of the three jewels of Buddhism, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Or as it's put, the Buddha's the past, present, and future, the Sadharma, which means the true Dharma, and the excellent community. So the excellent community does not mean the chaps that live through there. It means the whole community of Buddhist practitioners. Then we bow to all shrines and places in which the Bodhisattvas have been. So at this point we could imagine ourselves bowing to any shrines that we have come across, shrines or pilgrimage sites that we can imagine or that we've been to. And then we also see ourselves bowing, it says, to the teachers. I make reverent salutation to all the teachers, which of course could include past great figures of the Buddhist tradition, other teachers and spiritual friends who've helped us on our way. And finally, we salute all those to whom respectful salutation is due. So we express our respect to all practitioners of the Dharma. So there's a sort of descent here from the highest level, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, down to actual people we know. And bowing to them. So that moves us on to the third stage. The third stage is called going for refuge. And going for refuge is a bit of traditional Buddhist jargon if you haven't come across it before. I mean, we heard actually from Vadanya the other day about how going for refuge is, in our tradition, seen as the central act of the spiritual life. But I haven't got time to go into that really at the moment. So I'm just going to simplify by saying it's a bit of Buddhist jargon that most closely relates as commitment to practicing. What we go for refuge to is what we commit to living by. So it's not enough to just imaginatively invite the enlightened mind into our experience and show our respect for it. We also need to align ourselves with the enlightened mind so that the way we live, the way we're willing to live, is in accord with it, not in conflict with it. And that's what going for refuge is, expressing our desire, our commitment to do that. So we commit to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The respect we showed in the last stage means actually committing ourselves to the path, making that a reality. So we commit to the Buddha, we take enlightenment as our ideal, we commit to the Dharma, we actually commit to practicing the Dharma, the teachings that have come down to us, and we commit to the Sangha, the spiritual community, to making that a reality, playing our part in it and benefiting from it. Without that we couldn't get anywhere. So we commit. And after that stage, as part of that third stage, going for refuge, we chant what are called the refuges and precepts in Pali. So if you haven't come across those before, you'll be given a sheet that gives you the Pali and the translations. It's a very comely chant, but it's also very meaningful. It's very central. The refuges express our commitment to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then the precepts, the most basic principles of living a Buddhist life. That commitment to living by kindness, generosity, contentment, honesty, and awareness. So that's what we're doing. We're committing to that. So we commit to practicing the precepts. We commit to aligning ourselves with the enlightened mind that we've invited into our experience. And then the next stage might be a bit of a shock after that, because then we have what we call confession of faults as the fourth stage. Having committed ourselves to the precepts, to practicing the precepts, to living by the Dharma, we might become painfully aware of all the ways that we don't. We may see the habits that keep us stuck in our small perspective. So we need to acknowledge that, not brush it under the carpet. It's not a question of, it's not a practice of sort of beating ourselves up. It's a practice of being real about where we are so that we know what we need to do. We need to see the obstacles that stand in our way, or else our practice is going to be based on delusion. So the next stage is what we call confession. We acknowledge the unskillful tendencies that block us from higher states. We express regret for the patterns, for the actions that create the patterns that created these tendencies, and we decide to behave differently in the future. And then that might be a bit of a down. So then we have another stage called rejoicing in merits, which has just a very, very different feel. Rejoicing in merits. We think of all the manifestations of the bodhicitta, of the enlightened mind, of just positive qualities, goodness that we see around us, from the small everyday acts of ordinary people to the manifestations of the Dharma and the Sangha in our lives, to the existence of the great spiritual beings, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We think of all that and we rejoice. We celebrate. We express our delight and our gratitude. We cultivate that sense of delight and gratitude. And this state of mind, I think, is a vitally important practice. It's a vitally important step in this progression. When we rejoice in the goodness we see around us, we join its team. We align ourselves with it. Second time I've talked about football tonight. I'm going to use a footballing analogy. If we support a football team, we align ourselves with it and we rejoice in their victories. Okay, we rejoice in their victories. Even more so, if we play for a football team, we share in its success as one of its players. So we hope to be playing in the bodhicitta's football team. And it may be other people that score the goals, but we rejoice in that just as much as we would have if it was ourselves that scored the goals. If we're playing for a team and another player scores a goal, we rejoice as though it's our own. We don't think that has nothing to do with us, only the goals we score count. So it's as though we are joining the bodhicitta's team when we rejoice in merits. We're joining the Buddha's team. If someone else forges ahead, we rejoice as much as if we'd done it ourselves, because we're all in this together. If someone else makes a spiritual breakthrough, we value and rejoice it almost as much as if we had done so. If someone else just does some simple good action, we rejoice in it. If we see that, we rejoice in that too. So it's an important practice, this, because it aligns us, it makes us part of that movement, that positive movement, because that's our team, as it were. I hope that analogy works at least a little bit. So it's an important practice, just rejoicing in merits. There's a sutra in the Mahayana tradition in which a king comes to see the Buddha. And the king says, well, it's like really difficult for me, Buddha, because I spend all day sitting on a throne and people keep coming to me and I have to say, off with his head, or probably doesn't say that because he's Buddhist. Probably says, give him a slap on the wrists. Or, yes, that land belongs to you and not you. And yes, well, we better send the army over there to defend. I spend all day doing this, so what time have I got to meditate? And the Buddha gives him a practice, which is to rejoice in the merits of his subjects. So, and he says, that will take you to enlightenment. Just rejoice in the merits of your subjects. So, rejoicing in merit is a way that aligns us with what's positive, aligns us with what's good. It's a really important practice. It's worth spending a bit of time on, and worth spending time meditating on, bringing it into our meditation, making it part of our metta bhavana. But it's here in this particular practice as a sort of next step, quite a strong step towards not just inviting the enlightened mind into our experience, but actually aligning ourselves with it, giving ourselves to it. Then after that, the penultimate stage in our sevenfold puja is called entreaty and supplication. We could say it's called asking for a teaching. That's what we're doing. We're asking for a teaching. And this shows receptivity. What we're doing is we're expressing receptivity to higher influence. We're saying we want to be taught. We want the bodhicitta, the enlightened mind, to influence us. It's not as though we want to sort of, me as I am now, become part of it. We actually want to be influenced by it. All too often we think we already know it all. I mean, it's a really strong sort of human tendency. We've got our views and our opinions, and we're not open to anything that contradicts them. Strange but true fact, if there was nothing in the Dharma that you found really contradicted your views, it wouldn't be any use to you, because it wouldn't be challenging. We need to change. That's what the Dharma is saying. So sometimes that's going to involve things that challenge the way we see the world. So we're expressing openness to change, openness to being taught, to being showed that the way we see things now isn't the final product. If we're not open to something higher than we are at the moment, we're stuck. We're just where we are now. So we need to develop that mental state of receptivity. Openness, welcoming new teachings, even if they challenge some of our old positions, even if they challenge our ego's view of things. So that's the next to last spiritual mood. We express this openness and receptivity, asking to be taught, not defending our preset views. And after this, we usually have a reading. We have a reading from the Buddhist canon. So we've asked, and now we get it. We get a teaching. And then after that teaching, we normally chant a Mahayana sutra called the Heart Sutra, the Heart of Perfect Wisdom Sutra, which generally is pretty unintelligible. It's sort of like saying, well, here's this teaching, which you can probably understand, but then here's this, which like what is that about? Which ends with a mantra. It's sort of saying, yeah, but the teaching's actually a bit beyond reason. You can sort of understand the Heart Sutra, but in a way it points to something beyond reason, and it ends with a mantra. Gone, gone, gone beyond, gone completely beyond. Yes! So it's sort of pointing to the fact that we may have had that teaching, but we need to sort of look at it in a particular way. We need to look at it that it's pointing at something which is actually beyond our understanding at the same time. So that's the penultimate stage, invoking that. And then we get to the climax, what's called the dedication of merit and self-surrender, what it's all been building towards. We dedicate ourselves in our imagination. We rehearse, if you like, giving ourselves to the enlightened mind, giving ourselves to the universe as a resource, opening up to the bodhicitta, opening up to the big mind that connects us to all beings. And I say we rehearse it because, well, we're not ready to do it yet. Maybe you are, in which case wonderful, but probably we're not actually ready. I mean, there's one version of the puja in which we say, the usual version, in fact, I give up my possessions. Yeah, okay, give me a car. We're rehearsing something. We're rehearsing something which is actually beyond us. We're not ready to do it yet. But part of us does want to. There's part of us which would like to move in that direction, or we wouldn't be here. Part of us does want to throw off that burden of cramped ego. And in this last section, we let that part of ourselves out of the cage. We give it some exercise and some fresh air. We let it run around, and it gets stronger. Okay. So we say, with no sense of loss, I give myself to all beings. I give my virtues for the benefit of all. May I be the doctor, may I be the nurse for all beings until the world is cured. And we continue in that vein. We express this giving of ourselves to the bodhicitta, which involves also giving ourselves to the universe, giving ourselves to all beings. And not in any sort of like, I suppose I ought to, way, but it's rejoiced in. I mean, it's likened to giving a wonderful feast for everybody. You know, you throw a party, it's an act of generosity, but it's fun. It's uplifting. So that's the sort of imagery of giving a great party for all beings. And as I said, we probably can't mean this totally. Well, we can't mean this totally. But we shouldn't let that worry us, because it's a rehearsal. It's preparing the way for enlightenment, the way children prepare for adulthood by pretending, through play. So that's the culmination of the puja: self-surrender, giving ourselves to the bodhicitta, opening up to big mind, or at least doing that in our imagination as a rehearsal that paves the way for the real thing. And that's still that's a very high goal. I mean, we're only rehearsing it, but it's still a very, very high goal. This is actually quite an advanced practice. But it can also work at a less exalted, more down-to-earth level. You can also engage in puja as a way of expressing our shared values, our aspirations, strengthening our commitment to those values, strengthening our sense of community. It really can do that, doing it together, our connections with each other. So it's fine to relate to the puja on this more down-to-earth level as an enjoyable bit of theatre and poetry and dancing, chanting, an enjoyable bit of theatre and poetry and chanting. I actually quite like to introduce a bit of dancing. Anyway, that connects our mind with the ideal, expresses and strengthens what we have in common, and creates that sense of a community based on shared values. Thank you.